All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Elder. I'm a staff product designer on the Foundations team. And I wanted to talk about just two things I'm working on today, iconography and illustration. So both visual, but also I wanted to walk through what I'm doing in Figma, how I'm leveraging that tool, how I'm thinking about iteration for visual design, how I'm thinking about MVC, and also how I'm thinking about kind of a one-to-many ratio. So as we talk about things that are design system related, doing things once for the benefit of it propagating to many, creating assets once for the benefit of reuse. So talk through some of that. I have just some simple notes to follow. So take this also as an example of not necessarily needing to prepare a deck. I prepared all my tabs and files and whatnot and put together slides. So I know this is a discussion that we've had about the showcase. So just wanted to call that out as an example too. So I'm going to jump into Figma and talk about iconography first. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've had an ongoing effort and a desire to update our iconography to a lighter stroke weight. There's in the document, there's a link to more about this in the background and the reasoning behind this. I feel like it has some benefits and other items, but specifically just wanted to walk through how I'm doing that in Figma. And so if we look at today, get up here, the icons in Figma today, they live in the component library under the icons page. They're broken out into different frames for categories, essentially editor, object, status, etc. And within there, we have our symbols, and there's a label next to it using auto layout to organize that. But one of the limitations here is that every time an icon needs updated, it has to be done in the actual file. So I want to first separate that out and kind of think about these in an isolated way. So I have created a GitLab icons file, and MVC here is basically the same icons, but a different weight. And how I achieve that, I'll get to in a second, but that was my MVC approach to support the desires that I wanted to do. And with that, I really wanted to work on simplifying the process. And, there's hundreds of icons here. I think there's, I don't know, it's like 200 or something plus, but I needed to simplify the process to make this easier. So what I did was duplicate the file and I created placeholder for everything that needed to be updated. So here's an example of just, okay, it's red. This is actually using the old stroke weight. It needs to be updated so that I could walk through, go through, update the glyphs, update the symbols, and kind of work through that. So my initial starting point was to start with like really lightweight documentation to make this easy for myself to do. And with that, I created just a little guide here that says, hey, if I'm using a stroke weight of 1.5, which is in there, and there's, like I mentioned, there's background on that. If I want the border radius to be consistent, when I'm center aligning the stroke, I need to have the border radius set to 0.25. If I'm using the outer, it's this. So created some really lightweight documentation to make it easier to go through and essentially recreate all the icons. And so that was my first pass, is to really just recreate these. I went in and created new layers, etc. The current items, if I just zoom in here, you could see the outline there. It's actually just a solid shape. It's a fill, and so they had to be recreated. I want to prevent that in the future, and so what I've done is actually use strokes for as much as possible, meaning that if we continue with this type of a icon style, it'd be really easy to update this to to a 2 pixel again if we wanted to, etc. So wanted to make that future proof as possible. And so that was my first pass, going through updating these, getting into layers and shapes and keeping them kind of broken apart, not merging anything. And as I did that, I noticed that there's a lot of elements that are reusable. And so I wanted to figure out, like, how can I leverage some items in here to make it easy to be consistent? If I look at today's icons, it'd be very hard to look and see, is this checkbox the same size, or is this check mark the same size as this check mark, et cetera. And so I wanted to reduce some of that. And what I've done is create some reusable elements. This is still a work in progress as I've gone through figuring out what's duplicated or not. So you can see I've got some arrows in here, got some chevrons, and I did that for multiple sizes. And the reason for that is just because then I can support that in different ways throughout the icons. Creating one instance, one direction, because you can flip it, rotate it, et cetera, as you need it in different use cases. So having one means that I can update it in so many other places. So there's a benefit there. So leveraging components, that was kind of a second pass, going through and working through each icon, if you will, and updating that with the reusable elements. So just a little bit of how that works here. Let's see if I can get everything on screen. If I were to, let's just move this down here. If I were to take this and get into this here and start messing with some of these, attributes or placement, you can see it propagates through the rest of these icons. And because I'm doing that affords me the ability to update a style globally. If we want to do a different border radius, if we want to do a different weight even, I can do that in one place and have it propagate to all the icons that leverage that component, that kind of a base foundational element. So that was something that's been really helpful. And even with creating new icons, it'll be something that has a lot of value. Something that's new to me in Figma is the way it works with vector. And so before, in the component library, icons would just be simply merged into like a flat shape without any stroke. So that's why you just see kind of the outlines of the object there. It's just a fill. There is no stroke to use to make this. But under a new paradigm, what Figma does with its unions, and I just wanted to highlight this feature, is it allows you to keep items in a non-destructive way, but then the output is still the same. So the SVG code that I output is still the same SVG code. It's a solid object, but I can still edit it as though it were not. And so to demonstrate that, let's look at, let's see here, let's pick a good one. Let's look at archive for a second here. So if I turn this on, you can see I've got this stroke that's inset. And actually, I'm going to jump up here. This one's a little better because you can see that line in the center. And I have my component here, my angle component that I've used. And I have my border radius out here with the shape. And this is all pathed. So I'm able to continue to update this in a non-destructive way. But yet, if I go up here to the icon itself, you'll see that only a fill is selected. And so it's just been really helpful to use that for unions and make it non-destructive. What's cool about this is that anytime we needed to update an icon, the original is essentially here. It's not like I have a duplicate elsewhere that's all the raw assets and then I combine them into the final like you would in maybe Illustrator. So that's like a massive benefit and the power of unions. And one of the other things, lastly, I'll highlight here is that it allows me to update this for future reference, like I mentioned, and do different things like maybe sizing. So let's just take an instance of this merge request icon. If I wanted to, let's say in the future, make a version of this that is, let's say, 24 pixels to stick with our grid. Right now, you can see I've got this in here. I can go ahead and I could actually, if I wanted to, I could update the original and it'll propagate to that new size. But I also have the ability, since this is still a union based on original assets, I could come in here and say, you know what, on the 2.5 or the 1.5 dimension of the 16, so the 24 pixel, I actually want to use just a 2 pixel stroke. I'd be able to do that really easily while maintaining the ability to adjust the the assets of the original and have them propagate. So if we ever think about doing icon sizes or larger illustrations off of these, all of those properties remain. So it's really easy to do like a one-to-many update. Lastly, I've been going through and creating all these as symbols and adding keywords so that our search for these is much better. Hopefully in the SVG project, we'll be able to mirror this so that if there's things that are related under like, these have like a Git theme, a merge theme, you'd be able to go under your assets in the SVG projects and search. But if I search for like merge here, I get everything that's related to that pulled up. So working also on that, which hopefully will make it easier for everybody to use these icons, especially ones that have multiple use cases. So to wrap up here, next steps for the icons, I'm going to continue working through updating any icon that has kind of the red text that needs updated to the new style, and creating symbols out of everything and adding keywords. Then I'm going to create an MR in the SVG project to update this. And hopefully, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. Yep, keywords. And create an MR through the SVG project, test it in the product to make sure that these are all updated correctly, etc. So that's next steps there. Next up, I wanted to talk about illustration, and specifically kind of geared around empty states, but also kind of taking a step back further. Since I've joined GitLab, I really wanted to work on updating our illustration style. And with the addition of Vic on the brand and marketing team, she's done like a fantastic effort to update that and to document that. And so now I'm in a good place to really kind of ride on those coattails and leverage what's been done there and update the illustration style within the product based on what brand is doing. So I wanted to walk through a little bit about what brand is doing and how I'm leveraging it and thinking about it for the product. So really quick, the brand standards document, this is available through the handbook. You can download it. I could post a link later, but there's a section on here for illustration. I won't read through all of this today, but you get a sense of how we're using connections and lines and openness in the illustrations to really capture some of the GitLab values. So not only do these points allude to commits, but they also allude to connections. They also allude to openness. So starting there, leveraging some of that. Here's some of the iconography that is created on the marketing side. There's some subtle nuance with using kind of a monochromatic feel and some inset to give it some dimension. But then it also has expression in files like this, where there's more color added. And there's just kind of a preview of all of these assets that are existing in Drive on the marketing side. And then Vic created a kind of a one-sheeter for me based on what she's done with the palette and some of the concepts, just how they're broken out on different backgrounds, etc. So taking all of this, I'm starting with the brand, starting with what she's created and bringing it into the product. If I go to our illustration library today, it's full of illustrations that look like this. It's a very limited color palette. It's very flat. And so it's time to give it an update. So what I've done with my process is starting on with what Vic has done. I started with the palette, and I went through a palette building exercise. And what I did was I took everything that she had and I essentially created a symbol out of it, and that way, or a component, and that way I could duplicate it, test it on Dark UI, which I'll get to in a moment, and started going through and saying, okay, what works, what doesn't, what's going to work for the product, what's not. When I think of combinations, accessibility, or ease of reuse, creating patterns for others to follow, what is going to be the best approach. And so we'll walk through everything, every decision in here. Suffice this to say, I went through all the palette, tested out different opacities, tested out different combinations, and arrived at a single set of styles and elements to follow. Some things are actually additive from what is created on the brand side, just to create some consistency. So where all of the hues didn't have maybe 3 options, I've gone ahead and made sure that all of them have 3 options: a highlight, a base, and a shadow, so that we have way more variety in color and in depth, and liveliness, for lack of a better term, to explore and to kind of inject in these. And so from there, I started to think about the grid. Today, our grid is pretty simple. We have, let's see here, I don't have it on this page here, but we have a basic template where there's just 3 sizes, and it's basically that size or less. And I wanted to do something that was a little more prescriptive, because as you can see through the empty states, some of these are rather large, some of these are rather small, and there's just not a level of consistency that I'd like to have based on like the work that we're doing with illustration and in other places of the product, specifically empty states. So really wanted to tighten that up. So I did a lot of grid exploration, and where I've landed is that there's still 3 main sizes. There's large, there's medium, and small. And one addition to this is creating something around isometric. It's something we talked about on Slack, but introducing a new grid that we could use to help indicate depth. Right now, a lot of our illustration is flat, and it becomes challenging to indicate relationships and process through those illustrations, so they become overly complex. I think introducing an isometric grid will help simplify that, but also make some of our concepts easier to use. And I know that it's a technique, it's a style that's been around forever, and in some cases it's played out, some cases not. I'm hoping to leverage our updated illustration style to make it a bit fresh, but also just useful. I think at the end of the day, if you look at like an IKEA product manual, like the isometric, it helps to understand how to put stuff together. So I want to take that approach. And then the other side of the grid is just doing something that's a little more simple and focused. So creating focal points, leveraging a rule of thirds, and by doing that, creating the ability to make it easier to establish, like, where should main content go? What is the size? By having fixed dimensions, it'll make it a lot easier to follow. Once again, this was something else that was brought up on Slack, and we discussed it there about, would you rather have more flexibility or more rigidness? And it was clear that more rigidness would be helpful, and I think so as well. Let's see here. I want to talk about light and dark UI really quick, because dark UI is a popular topic, and it's an area where our illustration falls short today. And it's not because of anything that anybody's created, other than the fact that the illustrations were just designed with one mode in mind. And so when I change this background, you can see how garish and how strong some of these illustrations can be in a dark UI. And that's problematic. And so I really wanted to address that. And I explored a few ways to do that. One being in the SVG code, using CSS variables so that we could easily change the property of that element within the SVG to follow a certain color mapping. But I found that was a bit challenging and could be problematic, because every time you create an SVG, then you have to go in and manually add that mapping. So I wanted an easier way. And what I netted out with, and what I'm considering kind of work in progress right now, is using transparency, opacity, to help convey some of the same meaning. And you can see that a little bit here with the styles, where I've started to play out how this might look. The left-hand side is like the main component, and the right-hand side is a duplicate of it with a darker background. So I can test everything one-to-one really easy without having to duplicate. I can just move things around, etc., change the color and see how it looks. And this has been really helpful in my process to do that. Conceptually, when you think about dark UI, there's items that you want to recede in both, right? So you might have a background object like like Vic has here. And how do you get that to recede in both dark and light UI? If you use this at face value with the solid fill, this is going to actually be brighter on a dark UI, which is opposite of what we want. And so by leveraging opacity, I'm able to blend with the background and then create the same effect in both a dark and light UI. So it's receding in both. And I'll jump into a few examples really quick here. All right. So first example is just this demo here of a scan test. I used inspiration from Andy on an isometric illustration he had created a while back, just to see how I could leverage this and create this based on the styles I've used in dark and light UI. So I've got some kind of test items here. And what I've done is I've taken the grid, in this case, the isometric grid. I've created a symbol out of the illustration. And by doing that, I'm able to lay it on different backgrounds and just test it one-to-one. So if I come in here and move this item, I see that what happens with the change in the other context. I can come in here and say, well, maybe I want this to feel more solid. But if I do that, you can see it works for light UI, but for dark UI, the effect is the exact opposite. And so I'm able to really test these things out and work through the dark light UI at the same time by working on a single instance. So that's how I'm working through that, thinking through that, hoping to set up like a template that would be useful for others to follow, that would have this kind of same vein where you create it once, but you have the ability right there to essentially test right away in both light and dark UI. And so here's a few other tests on that. Here's a key, bringing in some more color and seeing what that looks like. Obviously, this is kind of the element we want to stand out, the plus to stand out, and does it achieve that in both a light and dark UI? That's the question I'm asking myself, and this is the way I'm testing that and working through it. And then let's see here. I've got a few more points. The next one is just reducing complexity and variation. In the illustration library today, you can see there's just so many different elements, so many different things. And I really want to reduce that and take a step back. Illustration, the way we use it in the product, is very much complementary. It's not the main subject matter. And so when you see something like this that I created some time ago, it's just overly complex for what we're trying to use it for. And although it feels, for me, a bit simple, I think it's necessary to help pull back and really let illustration be complementary. Focus as much on the action as the metaphor, where this focuses very much on the metaphor of documents and CI/CD being brought into a page. There's nothing to do with action. And when we refer back to Jarek's presentation about empty states and action and like, what do you want somebody to do with it? I want this to be as much about the thing as the action you do with it. So in this case, okay, it's an access key and we're creating a new one. It's an empty state, there aren't any. So let's create a new one. Here's an empty admin for like an OAuth. Well, we need to create one. So let's indicate that we're creating something new. So simplified and very focused on metaphor and action equally. And then with that, repeatable elements. So working on creating a library of different connectors and assets and shapes that can be reused anywhere. And there'll be a lot of these. I'll probably go through like the library that Vic has created and determine, okay, we have something here that represents continuous delivery. I'm going to create a symbol out of that. And then anytime we refer to that in a product illustration, we're using the same thing. We're speaking the same visual language as the product. And on the marketing side, somebody's learning about this feature on the marketing site, they come and they use the product. It's the same thing in an empty state. So really trying to create a one-to-one with reusable elements and leveraging that so that we don't have to keep making the same decisions over and over. And then next steps here, going to continue working through this process, testing out more illustrations just to give this some more time to work through. and test it out a little bit on different sizes, different use cases, more around the dark light UI, and then eventually start to integrate this into some empty states to complement the work that we're doing in Foundations with the rest of the empty states. So I know I've talked fast and said a lot, but I think we're close to time, so I'll stop sharing. I can jump over the document. All right, Austin, do you want to verbalize?
Yeah, so I mean, I love seeing all the updates that you share about like what Figma's pushing, and sometimes it fundamentally changes the way that we can build a component or maybe even an icon like you're highlighting with how the vector styles work. How often do you decide like, all right, it's time to go back and like completely rebuild the icon library because now we got a new way that we can construct them and merge them together?
Yeah, so, okay, maybe I missed, but as far as your question though,
Yeah.
with the updates, there's really the latest greatest. That's a great question, but I think having a single source of truth now is going to make that a lot easier. And so uh, with any kind of feature change, we can kind of opt into it and then extend it and propagate it. So that's how I'm approaching it. And I also hope to isolate the icon file into its own, like outside of the component library. And in that way, we can also help manage some of the changes and things that would happen from Figma updates in that, as well as opening it up to more contribution. So.
Cool, that makes sense. So just as Figma releases new updates, you just kind of see how they play with our existing assets and then see if it's easy enough to extend or add on or opt in, as you said. And then,
Yeah, that's correct. Yep. And also depend on like the viability of that feature. Like, is it in beta or not? And does it add a lot of value? So.
cool.
Becca, if you wanted to, oh, you have read only. Okay. Christy.
Yeah. Thank you. This was super interesting. I really, really enjoyed it. I've gotten some questions lately on how our team is collaborating with the brand team, and this is a fabulous example. I am wondering if you and Tori could work to cut just that part of the video into its own separate thing and post to the CEO channel. And if y'all want my assistance with like more context around that sort of thing, just hit me up. But this was great, and I'm really glad you did it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if it would be helpful, we can add other examples. The brand team worked through quite a few exercises led by Monica earlier this year that several of us from Foundations and UX worked through and contributed back to, as far as documentation and naming and concepts and design sessions. So we can do that too.
Yes, yeah, additional context would be wonderful. Thank you.
Hey, Jeremy. So my first one was read only before, but I wanted to verbalize. Thanks for this. This was a masterclass in icon design and illustration. Thank you so much for the work you put into this. For me, this is like a keynote presentation ready to go, and like any design conference. So super happy to see this level of craft here. And I think it's a reflection of the space we are creating as a design community. So awesome work. And then to my actual questions, when you were showing the light and dark modes for illustrations, are there cases when opacity cannot account for specific needs of each team? I think this we can even extrapolate this to like UI components themselves, but are there a way in illustration to have overrides or exceptions for each team? Maybe in one team, green doesn't work as well, so you want to use blue, that kind of thing?
That's a good question. I want to say yes, in the fact that these are SVG. We could create like color variable classes to override like the default. So if the plus symbol needed to be red. You should be able to override that, I would think. I would say that the goal would be to be as consistent as possible. However, there might be times where, yeah, there would be that need, and I think we could explore that further. So if you have any instances of that or illustrations that you know of, that would be really helpful to share. And I'd be happy to work through that and test those out in this process. So
Yeah, absolutely. If I see
Yeah.
some motion, you.
yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, and just on that, I know that the current palette has been really limiting to everybody, and so I'm really excited to introduce a new palette, which will hopefully add not only just more expression and vibrancy to these, but also address some of those use cases where color is attached to meaning or state or something in the illustration, so that we have that ability to tweak it and change it as needed.
Any other thoughts or questions? Great, thanks Jeremy for sharing, this was awesome.